Good evening if you're in still in Los Angeles. Good morning for the rest of the world, and even good afternoon for those that are joining us in the Far East. Welcome back to day 3, the final session of the TAFFD's Future Africa Conference. I'm joined by Nonye, who is originally from Nigeria. But is now living in, after a short spell in New York, is now living, is Virginia, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay, and you're a family nurse practitioner, but you've also involved with very many other things. And the topic that you want to address us today is around the effective use of communication to reduce fear, anxiety, and build trust in healthcare settings, which obviously you're ably qualified. So welcome, and I welcome you to share your story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Edward. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Sinaka Chikalo. Thank you. It's about 1 a.m., so please bear with me. Like you said, I'm a family nurse practitioner, and that's a registered nurse with an advanced practice degree studies in the assessment, the diagnosis, and the treatment of disease processes, both in the pediatric and the adult population. And I've been in practice now as a family nurse practitioner for over 18 years. And prior to that, I was a registered nurse for about 10 years. And I actually got interested in studying communication, and the use of communication as a tool for trust development in the healthcare setting. Somewhat more for selfish reasons, if you may. I got very interested in this to help myself, because I was always a very anxious person. I was an anxious child who grew up to become an anxious adult. But I found over time that if I, implemented communication in a style that could help someone else, or at least assist someone else that I was engaging with to, become less anxious in my presence, that in turn helped me to be less anxious. So over time, of course, I've broadened this into the healthcare arena for a good period of 30 years. Another, incident that took place that made me become very interested in this topic was that's me, pretty much in the hospital bed. That was in 2013. I became a patient. I had a surgical procedure which debilitated me for quite a while. And I think for a period of over 5 months, I was recuperating and having all these different studies done. Thankfully, I'm much better today. But that experience was eye-opening one, because as a patient, I pretty much experienced firsthand a lot of the fears and anxieties that patients, felt in the healthcare setting. And that, spurred me into action to pretty much try to put together resources that I can share in the healthcare setting or even in educational settings to help, healthcare providers and patients to engage in ways to reduce fears and anxiety and optimize the consultation process. Another thing that I, realized was as time went on, it almost became a methodology that could be used successfully in different arenas. So I'm now on a mission to make sure that I put that word out there so that people that are interested in this can look at all the various resources that I have put together regarding this. I've written 2 books on this same topic. My first book was published in 2016, Simple Tips to Developing a Productive Clinician-Patient Relationship. And in that book, I detailed about 16 different scenarios, where clinicians and patients can implement strategic communication styles for patients that are presented with different underlying emotions that will kind of present itself in their attitudes. Sometimes patients will become opinionated or angry sometimes overwhelmed, dependent, sometimes suspicious. Some patients could become defiant or even talkative when they're very anxious. So in that book, I identify how clinicians can, identify these characteristics and know the actual communication style to implement to help that patient to alleviate some of these anxieties. And the contents of this book was pretty much, I would say, condensed into a form of a digital format and now presented in an online course where I presented that on a forum called Teachable. Teachable platform is an interactive site where these courses are now in a digital format. And the content of this course was also presented to accrediting board, the American Medical Association, the summer of 2019, and they reviewed it and they deemed it worthy to pass the accreditation process. So now it's been accredited so that it can grant continuing medical education credits both to physicians and to nurses. And I will give the website at the end where all this can be accessed. One thing I tried to do was in my studies to use strategic engagement styles like for healthcare providers to know the most appropriate times to use such styles at when to speak softly to create a tranquil environment in an otherwise charged room filled with tension, when to temporarily avoid eye contact when you're speaking to someone, just to give the person a chance to develop their train of thought, when to maintain eye contact and speak authoritatively to command attention so that you can take charge of a consultation process, when to nod in affirmation as someone else is speaking, just to give them a chance, to know that you are understanding their point and encourage them to go on, when to listen more than we speak, when to use humor even when an environment is, charged with tension. Sometimes humor does help to lessen some of that tension. Another thing that as time went on, I asked myself how other people were viewing this, if there were other studies that were out there, were there other scholars that were interested in fear and anxiety management. So on LinkedIn, I was very fortunate to come across Eunice Ifanichukwu, who introduced me to the TAFFD platform. And on the platform, of course, I met Osinaka Chikalo, who introduced me to the philosopher Deshuba and Fury's Dr. Fisher. And of course, I also was fortunate to really look at all their studies and all the articles that they had, the books they had also written. But I'm not a philosopher by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm not even going to begin to say I understand all the philosophical views that are out there concerning fearism and the study of fear. But I am a clinician, I'm a healthcare provider, and I've studied patient behavior for close to 30 years. And I'm also a very deep thinker. I take time to analyze things very deeply. And when I looked at Shuba and Carlo and Dr. Fisher's work, I found some similarities and differences in their studies. And the common thread of fear management was quite evident also in all of their studies. So I tried to separate each of their studies, my understanding of each of their studies. And I'll start with Deshuba. Deshuba is someone I admire a lot. I've had the chance to interact with him on and off LinkedIn, and I actually read his book, The Philosophy of Fearism. And one quote in his book that caught my attention was a quote of his that says, "Knowledge generates fear, and knowledge is useless if we don't understand the fears surrounding the knowledge." And this caught my eye particularly because my take on this is really that what helps us to fully understand the fears that we encounter You know, when we are faced with new knowledge or new experience, it's the conscious act that we put in to try to bring solutions to some of these fears. And I can relate to this because in 2013, when I was there in the hospital bed as a patient, it was a new experience for me. And I experienced a lot of fears, you know, due to this new experience. But what helped me to begin to manage some of these fears was the conscious act that I kind of embarked upon to develop resources that will help me to manage some of these fears. And someone asked me when, a long time ago actually, after I wrote the book, what kind of patient I was. And when I thought about it, I really was the dependent patient. There's a chapter of all the 16 chapters I devoted to the dependent patient. And a dependent patient, for me, it was more culturally based because being from Nigeria, I find out a lot of dependent patients due to culture are almost just a little bit shy and will not verbalize opinions very readily. So in the healthcare arena, they tend to depend totally to the, you know, on the healthcare provider's judgment. There's almost like that fear of even asking questions. There is that fear of upsetting the clinician when they ask questions. So I, you know, talk about the way clinicians can use open-ended questioning pattern to help the dependent patient to open up a little bit more and for engagement to be more productive in the consultation sessions. And an instance that I could also relate to with the Schubert studies on knowledge and fear management is this current pandemic of COVID-19 that we are all unfortunately experiencing. In line with his views, if we just focus on amassing and just gathering knowledge about the activities of this novel coronavirus, maybe thinking that we can just gather more knowledge about the incubation period, the testing, the treatment options that are out there. Then if we don't spend time to think about the after effects of the fears of this experience in the general population, then all that knowledge, it's almost useless. It kind of defeats the purpose. So the idea is to make sure that we don't neglect the other part of the equation, which is taking time to put together resources that will help the general population deal with their fears, like fear of losing health, fear of losing loved ones, fear of isolation. People are dying alone, unfortunately. Fear of economic instability that will take place post you know, COVID-19 era. So it's important to focus on all that aspects. And Michael Fisher, Dr. Michael Fisher is another gentleman that I've been in contact with, and I liked his 2015 article that he wrote titled "Educating Ourselves, a Lovist or Fearist Perspective." In that article, Dr. Fisher made a correlation about how we live our lives. He said that it's directly related to how we educate ourselves. And he also emphasized that there is an evolving view about fear, because what is fearful for one person may not be fearful for another person based on so many different factors. And I can relate to this in my own studies in healthcare, because I found that due to the different, you know, diversities that are out there, you know, due to our nationalities, ideas, views that are different based on the way we were brought up, we almost can look at the same thing but have different perspective about it. So based on that, I found that regardless of these differences in perspectives, the one thing that many patients, if not all patients, react positively to is compassion. So I spent a lot of my time also studying compassion in healthcare and how that can be relayed as a conscious act through the skills of communication, because compassion can be quite a vague term till you narrow it down and make sure that you explain it in a way that there are certain ways you can actually engage with another person to for them to feel that compassion coming from you based on your engagement style. one thing I also realized was that I really, really liked Osunakachi Kalu's views also, because I also studied some of his work, and Kalu emphasized that the basic foundation of philosophy is rooted in problem solving. And this is quite identifiable in the study of evolution of fear in healthcare, because I believe it's important for us to identify the root of so many fears that we see in healthcare, and then go further, to develop resources to help patients to begin to address some of those roots that some of them may not have even thought about, that it's actually affects their behaviors and their attitudes when they come into the healthcare arena. Because an example that I'll give was a popular article I wrote in 2018, I believe, and it's been published in some medical publications. It's titled "The Patient in Room 1B." And that article was really about me in terms of when I came to America. I was about 19 years old, many, many years ago. And at that point, I was a nurse's assistant. I started as a nurse's assistant, and I worked in I think it was a long-term care facility in Brooklyn, New York. And one day, my assignment that was given to me was taken away from me because I was told that the patient that I was assigned to did not wish to be cared for by Black people. I didn't quite understand the concept at that point because I was barely 19, fresh from Nigeria, just very happy to be in America to give it my all in the healthcare arena. But I remember quite honestly that the whole experience did not make me upset. I was not angry at any point. I was just very confused at that point. And it's kind of changed the trajectory of my life, because I started to then study human behavior and to find out exactly 25 years later, there was a chapter in my book where I wrote about the suspicious patient. And that was the characteristics that I delved into in that chapter, where I talked about the engagement styles that a healthcare provider can implement to help a suspicious patient begin to pull down some of the walls that had been built up over the years, and do it in a way that is loving and compassionate so that care can be delivered in an optimal manner. And finally, an important thing about this suspicious patient is that it's not related to race at all. One thing I've realized about the suspicious patients, it's really the deep-seated fears that lurk in every human subconscious, and that makes it hard for us to genuinely engage with one another and pull down walls. And it can be related to factors like age, gender, nationality, religion. So it's something to consider in healthcare delivery process. And the last factor that I'll talk about that plays a key role in trust development in healthcare is patients' perspective of and mistrust that comes up due to historical events. Historical real-life events can affect a patient's view about healthcare delivery. I was doing a research and I came across a CDC website that talked about a trial that was done in 1932, the Tuskegee trial, on a group of Black men who there was, I think, the intention to study the natural history of syphilis. But according to this website CDC report, there wasn't sufficient consent that was obtained from these men. And also the intention of the study was not fully explained to them. So if we look back, we will find that communities that have been affected by studies like this will have some sort of suspicion when it comes to healthcare delivery process. But it's important to know that regardless of what suspicion a patient may present with, that will kind of show up in their attitude, the healthcare provider has the skills, at least has the ability to engage strategically in a way that these suspicions can be either eliminated or reduced to give both parties a chance to make a more genuine connection for better healthcare practice. And a lot of my work can be found on my website, www.ptdrsimpletips.com. And I think I will leave it as this for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nonye. But as you were talking, obviously I'm immediately as a recipient of your words, I'm thinking back to my own experiences, as I'm sure many of the other viewers will be as well, of their good and bad, and in some cases just poor communication that we've received in various healthcare scenarios. I mean, in the UK, we talk about bedside manner, which generally, if a clinician, mainly a doctor, is got good bedside manner, they're good communicator, they're understanding, they have a good rapport with the patient, and those that are very, very good doctors, but just very poor communicators. And when you actually consider, most doctors are time poor in terms of their time in front of the patients, trying to assess, what's the history of this patient, how are they going to receive me, is how do I communicate best with them, is quite another skill set. Would you, unfortunately, I will now go and find your book and read it, but presumably in there you talk about, the additional skills that clinicians, nurses and doctors need in that scenario.
Absolutely. Yeah, it depends on the characteristics. Let's start with the positioning. When I was a patient, my healthcare provider, my doctor, would sit at the edge of my bed in the morning consultation process with me to find out, for us to review my labs and, to find out how I am coping for that day. And I just found that very comforting,
Yeah.
because there will be this eye-to-eye, eye-level contact. She wasn't towering over me, lying in the bed. She would just those very simple, subtle acts. A lot of time, doctors do not know what an impact it makes and how it really helps the trust development to take place within short periods of time. I talk about, because I don't want to go into a lot of details about the things I say in the book. Yeah, but those positioning styles is one that really stood out for me because it was practiced, so to speak, for me. So, and I wouldn't forget that each time I see that doctor for anything else.
Yeah.
Things like when there are patients, there's a chapter I call the impatient patient. The impatient patient will want to rush the visit along. And you find out more like in the retail clinic settings, there's some of these, settings where it's a bit more prevalent to find some particular characteristics than other settings. So with the impatient patient, you just have to take time to explain to the patient that I do need to get a complete history from you so that you can get the best care, possible. You find patients that could be the suspicious patient. It's another very interesting one, or the skeptical patient. You tend to almost would need to give a background of your own knowledge in terms of where you've worked, who you've worked with. And when you're performing assessment on such patients, you verbalize what you're seeing, what you're hearing. If you're listening to lung sound, you say lung sound excellent. You're looking at the ears look fine, there are no fluids, or there could be a little fluid, and that's become of allergy seasons. You just have to pick up saline to wash your nose. You find that step-by-step assessment process and verbalizing your findings helps a lot when it comes to a patient who is suspicious of your skills. You don't want to wait till the end of the visit and don't have any engagement, and then you just want to verbalize everything because they were a little bit suspicious of you in the first place. So it's a step-by-step process, and you have to maintain that verbalization. And after maybe 1 or 2 visits, you find that you don't have to do that anymore because you have gained their trust.
Yeah.
So a lot of these steps is not, it could be a bit daunting at first, a bit time consuming at first, but once you've done it 1 or 2 visits, you find that it just becomes very natural because that person has gained your trust and tends to ask for you as the provider each time they come, because somehow you're the one that make them comfortable in your presence more so than another. And for a period of 30 years, I can say that many people have asked to have consultations with me. They want to find out, when are you working again so I can come and see you? Because there is that presence that really helps them feel comfortable. And that's why I said I had to put down a lot of these in writing because it's something that I have practiced and really does work. It works.
Excellent. I'd like to come to Janadi. You had your hand up if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. And before I ask my question, I'd like to preface this by saying my friend Steele Archer, who is the host of Debt Nation and the next scheduled speaker, he's here, so I want him to hear this. I think he would be a good guest on his show and talk about some of these ideas in greater detail. But what I wanted to ask you was, I am fascinated by your remark that you undertook this medical career in part because of your own anxieties as a patient, and you wanted to learn more about medical conditions, and this has helped you in a significant way. And I'm curious if you would recommend that to other individuals who tend to be quite concerned sometimes if they have health phenomena that they can't quite immediately explain. They may go out onto the internet and do a lot of research about these phenomena, but sometimes that could only exacerbate their fears, because on the internet, if you look up a particular symptom, 9 times out of 10, you're going to find some website that says, oh, this could be cancer, oh, this could be diabetes, this could be some other very severe condition, when in fact, if you go to a doctor, you get your blood work done, most times you'll find out that, no, you don't have that. There are many other potential explanations. And having a more systematic medical education helps one see these kinds of phenomena more proportionally. So would you recommend lay people who have these concerns to undertake some sort of formal training? And if so, what are some accessible types of training that someone could get? Because obviously not everybody can become a medical doctor just because of the time and expense, or even a nurse. That takes time as well. But is there any path out there that will help patients like that become more informed and in some ways alleviate their anxieties?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Good question. I actually, my book has, there are 2 sections in the book. The first part of the book, I said for the patient, and the second part for the healthcare provider. And the section for the patient, I delve into, just pretty much what you talked about, how patients should avoid, just researching on the internet a lot of these symptoms that could signify so many other diagnoses and increase their anxiety by the time they get into the healthcare providers. There were also some other things that I talked about in that section in terms of how patients, when they come to the clinic, the way they should engage, with healthcare providers. Write down your thoughts in a little cheat sheet to help you keep track of the questions to ask, because many people in front of a clinician pretty much start to blank out, and not be afraid to have second opinions, because these days healthcare really should, at least optimal healthcare, it should be an interactive one, and a good healthcare provider should know that it's not really a monologue anymore. The dialogues have to take place because patients know their bodies more than any clinician can ever know their body. So in that way, it becomes an open dialogue, and patients should not be afraid to ask questions. And if you don't feel comfortable with a clinician, you have the right to get a second opinion and maintain an open mind when you meet a clinician, A lot of things I actually wrote down. That's the funny thing about when you write. That was in 2016. So some patients that I come across, believe it or not, I go back to my book to remind myself what I wrote. Because sometimes I'm like, oh, that's a strange behavior. I don't quite remember if I touched on this. And then I look in the book and I did touch on it. And then I remind myself what I wrote about it. Because the memory does tend to fade, unfortunately, with age. And since then, I have written another book. So I don't focus a lot on the 2016 book. But that was a very good question you asked them.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Zoom's playing up again. There we go. I think I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Anonya, again, for joining us from Virginia on the East Coast of the US. I'd like to give you a round of applause from everyone here. Everyone is on video. And our next guest is continuing on the communications theme. And specifically transhumanism and communication. We're joined by Steele Archer who's located in Melbourne, Australia. Steele, good afternoon to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah. What a great conference. Well done to TAFFs. Round of applause for TAFFs. Osin Akalchi, everyone like this. Even if this is just the beginning of something brand new, the idea is fantastic. A continuous stream of information and idea sharing, and I am a big fan, and very happy to have learned about TAFFs early on in order to help promote them, and they are just going to do absolutely huge things. So big round of applause to Osin Akalchi and to the TAFFs family out there doing really, really great stuff. Love this format, and you, Mr. Edward, doing a great job, guarding the airwaves, so to speak. So transhumanism and communication, interesting topic, a very interesting topic. Well, really depends what you want to start talking. I mean, definitionally, I find transhumanism fascinating in the fact that it's capitalists and libertarians that really have taken the reins of transhumanism in this sort of late stage of where we are on the transhumanist curve. There's a lot to be said about transhumanism and communication, in the fact that transhumanism is something that is inherently human. I mean, fire being constructed as a technology, as a tool, as a technology, have really changed the game of the human trajectory. And I think you really have to start with, what is fire trying to say? Fire as a tool, as a technology, and you work forward from there, because after you get fire, you get the enhancement of the human condition and the changing, the orientation, the reinterpretation of what it is to be a creature, an embodied creature of biology of animal origin, moving through time, facing certain conditions, and overcoming different challenges, overcoming natural challenges, overcoming human challenges, overcoming challenges of psychology, overcoming challenges of human nature. So we as humans, since the invention of fire, really had to start communicating in general. This is linguistic, this is cave paintings, this is vocally, this is through numerical advantages and interpretations. And if you know the story of the number 0, you work out how long it is to get that fine number. So it's a really interesting story, and And I think the whole expression of transhumanism is like the whole experience of humans is transhumanism. Therefore, we're talking about the whole of human communication, whether that be verbal, non-verbal, intergenerational, etc., as a expression of transhumanism. Now, what you probably want is not, what is this guy talking about? What you probably want is how is this relevant in the 21st century? And that's probably where you start to get, the bigger topics. The Greeks arguing over philosophy, inventing gods for certain dispositions of human nature, reflecting their inner insecurities out onto these, and the best of what we are, out onto these gods and stuff. It's a very, very imaginative form of transhumanist communication, I think. But, what we probably want to talk about is transhumanism in the 20th century and the 21st century, because you really start to see a curve there. I think transhumanism, though, in a way, being diffused through information is probably, actually, you've got to start talking about it at the printing press. I think this is when information really starts to get diffused, and you had this dual idea of the Renaissance and the printing press. And I think this is when technology really started to become enhanced and used for the benefit of people, the implementation of technology into the human condition, when it started to really become this transhumanist type idea. Until then, a lot of technology had been of circumstance. It had been of, to enhance society over another society, and to create civilization for civilization's sake. The Greeks and the Romans embodied, well, the Greeks especially, are the civilization for civilization's sake. They were very scared of nature. They were very scared of anything that wasn't transhumanist in a way. And the Romans, coming from, this Romulus Remus remit, this story, didn't invoke their own civilization for that own sake, but as a more of a sacred object in itself, not just as a civilization. If they wanted that, they would have just been Trojans, but they weren't. They were something unique and different, and something that came to dominate the rest of history. And we're living in the wake of that Roman experiment now with the reemergence of the American Empire. So transhumanism really starts at the printing press, and then you get Nikolai Fedorov, you get the cosmists who really did a lot of work, the Russian cosmists who did a lot of work to lay down kind of what transhumanism was. But again, it's not a capitalist idea. So there was kind of a more solid definition of what transhumanism was. It's not until you get into Julian Huxley and you get to the 90s social revolution that you get capitalists and libertarians who really get in the middle of transhumanism and mix it up and stir the pot around and start playing with it. And I think that's where you are today with transhumanism in this way. I think you've had a diffusion of information, you've had a diffusion of ideas, you've had this explosion in definitional rights and liberties. And I think that's where transhumanists kind of are split up nowadays. They're all over the shop. You've got pseudo communists who are trying to redefine transhumanism in their own image, but it's very hard because they have to do it in an ongoing and creeping capitalist society that wants to always infuse competition. And so then you end up with this vast interest. And what is the vast interest? The vast interest is sort of shone through different mediums, whether that be the mainstream media, the mass media, televisions, blogs, newspapers, news, the internet, all of these different mediums. And the mainstream media tries to define transhumanism through its lens of continual reinterpretation. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you see it on CNN or CNBC or the business people or something like that, where transhumanism is reflected as business news. It's reflected as growth of technology for technology's sake, in the fact that there's innovation sprouting out of a capitalist system, searching for profit, searching for innovation, and searching for growth for the capitalist system, which I think is fascinating because that lends itself to continual reinterpretation and reinvigoration. You have social media, which is redefining the landscape. And social media, they don't worry so much about academic forms of communication in terms of what is transhumanism, what is it used for, because everybody has an opinion, everybody has a voice. So that means that transhumanism, in effect, is its own living object. It's its own living interpretation and definition, which is continually being rediscovered, not in the same way as the mainstream media discovers and rediscovers and redefines transhumanism, but in a more human way that actually means that people can shine a light on their own definitional sort of understanding. And that is because people have unique circumstances wherever they are around the world. They have unique needs for transhumanism. Some people need prosthetics. Some people need bionics. Some people need different things. And so that therefore their focus is not on what the business news is searching for, which is innovation, capital, profit seeking, growth for growth's sake, and stuff like that. These literary notions on social media are more searching for the actual fruits of transhumanism. They're searching for the fruits of transhumanism. And where you get detonation and where you get, because like, I think what happens is without positive communication skills, without people like TAFFD, without institutions and political functions like the United States Transhumanist Party, without, entrepreneurs in the scene like Aubrey de Grey, Ray Kurzweil, Peter Thiel, or Elon Musk, or anybody who's actually showing that transhumanism can be a force for inherent good, whatever side these people stand on. Some people really hate, I'm a big Elon Musk fan. I don't know. Some people really hate the guy because they think that he's going to exploit the universe, in a capitalist way, which is okay. But, they want a different definitional stance to him, but he's making space exciting in a particular way. But, without people like this, or Mr. Kurzweil, or Aubrey de Grey, or some of these other people, whatever stance they shine a light on, the news in terms of communication, well, we all know bad news sells right? It's the bad news sells the best. And so what did we hear? What was the big story that dominated last year? Well, I'll tell you, it was probably Jeffrey Epstein. And the problem with something like Jeffrey Epstein is the media, and that's the legacy media, what we now coin the legacy media, because they make money off tragic stories like this, they find a term like transhumanism, or they find a reckless association like Jeffrey Epstein, and then they label it. And that's how the mainstream media is very, very good at labeling people and objects and things that they don't understand so much, not continual innovation, but things that they don't understand and that they know that the public does not understand fully. And they'll put a label on it and they'll say, no, these two are associated, they're intertwined, they're interlinked in enormously destructive ways. And that they know that they sit atop the verification table. So if you want something verified, people make fun of the mainstream media, but they also use the mainstream media as a verification technique over random news websites and communication tools. So you get a story like Jeffrey Epstein and whatever the heck he did, and then saying, well, that is transhumanism. That is an association of people like that do that. And so I think in that way, that is a negative distortion in the communication table for profit and for needs and desires by, I think, outdated media agencies that are trying to reevaluate and reconsider themselves as judge and juror over intellectual ideas. And because they're losing their grip on this idea, because they won in the when the Berlin Wall fell, they won. So now they've become irrelevant and they have to reassert themselves. And so I think like this association that they proclaimed between Jeffrey Epstein and transhumanism, which everybody knows was totally a farce, was an attempt at reasserting themselves into the arena, into the space, and trying to put a stamp that everything else that they say is completely valid, even though we've called it out many times. They can't call out economic stuff. They couldn't call Donald Trump's presidency. They couldn't call a lot of stuff. We can go on and on and on about the failings of the mainstream media and their complicit their complacency and complicit notions with mainstream advocates of different special interest groups. But I think what's happening now is, I think even though those sorts of associations, those sorts of plays by the mainstream media were had, I think that we're moving into a different era now. And I think that the communication strategy is TAFFs, it is Detonation, it's other organizations that are actually trying to stray away and go away and leave the cultural enterprise to itself, because on one hand they themselves are becoming irrelevant in the fact that the technology that they don't understand is leaving them behind, and that's an interesting fact, and it's leaving not only them behind, but it's leaving the population that they say that they support and care about behind. And without them educating, and without them doing proper journalism, and without them really actually finding a true definition and a definitional stance and a foundation and a solid foundation of what transhumanism is, the benefits of transhumanism, the actual health outcomes, the health benefits, the social outcomes, the political benefits of transcending beyond our current limitations as a species, without them actually lucidly stating this into the mainstream political sphere, they themselves are actually writing their own downfall in this area. And I've seen this I'm watching this play out in real time, and they don't understand this. A lot of them are, I think larger owners of tech companies in the media space make their money from this stuff, and understand this more in a cybernetic sense. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Twitter. I think these people are more in tune with this than, say, someone like Rupert Murdoch. And again, it doesn't mean that the old tricks of the newspaper, and it doesn't mean the old tricks of cable news or pay TV or whatever won't work, because they're very good at swinging political further one way or the other. And we've seen this with Donald Trump and the Fox News idea. Won the 2016 political battle from that alliance. But I do think that there's a new world emerging, and I think that new world is simultaneously getting smaller and getting larger. And I think it's getting larger in the fact that these technologies are going to impact more people in a more positive way. I think it's getting smaller in the fact that there's only so many people that can survive the economic, political, and social crises, so, such as people in this room and a few and others, scientists and philosophers, thinkers, artists, revolutionaries, music types, entrepreneurs, skilled inventors, AI people who actually make a genuine difference in society, a positive difference. That I think that this is the new test, and I think that communication sphere is shrinking, while the general benefits will only get larger. And I think that the general benefits of transhumanism getting larger will continue to be reinvented by the business people, by the business media, by CNBC, by Fox Business. And I think these people will sell the benefits and products and spillovers of transhumanism as innovation and as general health and societal benefits. I think that's what's going to happen. I think transhumanism as an idea will always miss the boat in this arena. I think transhumanism will always be misunderstood in this arena. Does it mean that it shouldn't any less get our praise? No, I think that's wrong think. I think it should always get the praise that it deserves. But will it always be the misunderstood kid because of the influences of diffusion of information, because of the people who own the shares and the influences and agendas of people in the mass media, and because of a general misunderstanding and miscalculation of the general population about why exactly they have mobile phones in their hand and how that came to be, and how come the internet is so like electricity and the Internet of Things. Why is the electricity even something as ubiquitous as water? I think the general population, when this sort of stuff is drip fed to them in a way that it has been, will always be acclimated to the benefits. They didn't even notice that they don't have the measles anymore until you don't notice, until COVID-19 comes along. So I think that I probably run out of time, but look, communication and transhumanism, it's a really interesting topic. And I like talking about it. I started a whole show talking about communication and transhumanism because I find it fascinating. Sorry if I've gone over time. I wasn't really counting.
That's completely understandable. You're clearly a passionate man about transhumanism. I think that whilst people are being locked down, and I use that term literally in some countries, they are becoming frustrated with the continual commentary from of world events and COVID-19, and I think they are gradually waking up and switching off on mainstream media. And hopefully, we can only hope that we have a situation where we emerge from this situation with a few more people that are actually listening to other communication forms and not listening to what they're spoon-fed and indoctrinated by the mass media. I'd love to
digital.
Go on. Sorry.
Well, I mean, the TV revolution is definitely dead in a certain context. I mean, it's definitely the fact that the digital natives just do not watch TV. So it's not TV so much, but these guys from TV, they did leak over and they did hijack certain Facebook. They've got a good brand. They've got a good selling point, and a lot of people do trust them and what they say and what they write. And remember, people's attention spans, I mean, in the 50s, people's attention spans were like an hour long. In the 90s, people's attention spans were about 12 minutes long. In the 2000s, people's attention spans were about 6 minutes long. People's attention spans now are about 4 or 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 10 seconds, up to a minute for older generations. And people's attention spans have really diminished. So if you see something on your newsfeed that says, this is a new cool new gadget, transhumanism just flew past you but it wasn't defined correctly. But also that's the benefit of transhumanism as well, in the fact that it doesn't have to be defined correctly if it's enhancing human life, human health, human well-being.
Yeah, and then that's the big thing that I have about having been involved in innovation for the last 30 years within various industries, is the fact that quite for the sake of tech, or for the shareholder, not for the good of humanity or the actual improvement, the positive aspects of the technology and what it can bring. And on that point, I'd love to come to Gennady. He's had his hand up to ask you a question. Oops.
Yes, thank you very much. And Steele, I appreciated your comments. You kind of drew a chain of causation from ancient Greece and Rome to contemporary transhumanism, which is quite a feat, and definitely there's a lot more to be said on this. But in terms of contemporary transhumanist communication, you've been in a unique position with the Detonation show in having been able to have these extensive conversations with key figures from all over the transhumanist movement, people representing different organizations, different perspectives, different fields of endeavor. Indeed, one could use the archives of the Detonation show to reconstruct a quite detailed and accurate history of the movement over the past year. And I'm wondering if in the course of those interactions, you have noticed some patterns about how this movement is developing. What are some of the key changes that are underway? And furthermore, is transhumanism penetrating into the mainstream to a greater extent? Do we have a chance of supplanting the legacy media, the legacy political organizations, the previously conventional but now increasingly untenable ways of thinking that have pervaded contemporary societies?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I do think that, and it's inherent with the people who are involved. The people who are involved, incredibly skilled, incredibly smart. They're ingenuitive. At sometimes, they're well resourced, but they're incredibly passionate. And you find this you find this at the beginning of any social or revolutionary change. The people usually have an inbuilt desire to change injustices in structures that they see and perceive exist. And so, the energy is there. And the thing about transhumanism is, despite a lot of socialist leaning and communistic type characters involved with it, they all bring their perspectives into a capitalist framework, which produces a lot of energy. And, like I was saying, I don't think this is a moot point that there's a lot of libertarians and capitalist types who are involved. Zoltan Itzvan manages to get praise from very different actors such as Ben Zion and to Rachel Haywire, to Mr. Shatke, to anybody else. Zoltan Itzvan can get the applause from a wide variety of people who normally would not applaud, say, a libertarian. And so I find that fascinating about transhumanism, that political actors and actors from all over the political spectrum can somehow rally around a point that they normally would not rally around. Now, does that make the union especially strong? Well, it gives it a certain sense of strength. It also lends itself to a lot of self-criticism and internal complication. But that also, in a sense, is a strength. Because constant self-criticism and self-reflection is great when you have a unity type goal. And it does. It has a unity type goal. And I think around a lot of the dangers that on the darker side of technological advancement that we see again in mainstream media or reflected through big cultural enterprises like Hollywood, which again, bad news sells well. So the Terminator, fantastic box. I've never seen it actually, but by the way, fantastic box office, makes a lot of money. A lot of these Total Recall, a lot of these negative technological cultural artifacts that now exist produced from Hollywood do very well in the minds of the mainstream populace, because selling negativity is quite easy. It's quite good to do. It's not a hard sell. Selling positivity is actually harder to do. Now, the thing is once it's hard to sell positivity, but actually people inevitably almost always want positivity. Suddenly in this COVID-19 reflection, suddenly everybody wanted ventilators everywhere, and they wanted hospitals everywhere, and they didn't want all the chaos that came from non-preparation. We survived the Cold War A-OK. We're going to survive climate change A-OK, because humans have this very primitive reactionary policy that once they hit a certain threshold and they feel themselves going over the abyss into the eternal darkness, they pull back from that, either as individuals or as a collective, and they do not like it. And they tend to fight for their lives. But the thing about people as biological ape type creatures is you have to push them up to the very edge, and we have, and there's plenty of stories in history where men and women and humans alike have to be pushed to the very edge before they react. So selling positivity, telling someone, something as a collective before we get there isn't very smart or sustainable. It's only in reflection that people say, oh, that was actually a very clever thing to do. And so it's a lot harder to do. So I think that you have to take advantages of certain crises, and you have to take advantages and try and get people to think forward, think positively, think about scenarios and how they can be avoided. Elon Musk does this very well. Ray Kurzweil does this very well. Aubrey de Grey does this very well. Lots and lots of transhumanist leaders evaluate scenarios, whether they're on a humanity level issue or on an individual level issue, and are very good at saying to people, we should probably avoid this. We should probably avoid the vacuum. And some people listen. And when enough people listen, you don't need that many people to listen in order to generate a revolution. And I think, speaking of communists, I mean, the Lenin and Trotsky and whatever, those guys started from a beer hall in Nowheresville in, I don't know but Belgium or something, right? And they went on to launch, and the ideas themselves generated a revolution that dominated the 20th century. Capitalism. Adam Smith, he didn't live to see his own writings come to fruition in a certain respect. He only could observe the marketplace from his window when he was a student. But his writings also eventually came to fruition, and we are far beyond topics of capitalism and communism in the 21st century with resource distribution mechanisms that can be automated. I don't think it's about that anymore. Which is, again, the UBI argument. We're not talking about UBI, but transhumanism is and can be rallied. It's the problem about the rallying concept is that there's no central resource mechanism that has enough push and pull with the business media in order to, when a new innovation comes out, and I think Peter Zing is on the edge of breaking through this, and I think something like Singularity University actually is pushing in the right direction for this. When innovation comes out that needs to be accredited with transhumanism, that's the real point where people have to say and think, oh, there's an association matrix there. Otherwise, if the branding is always going to miss, then the revolution will never be afoot and be set afoot.
Yeah, we've got another question from Austin Akachi. I've just unmuted you.
Okay, my question goes to Gennady. So my question goes this way: is there any necessary connection between transhumanist movements and the avant-gardes?
A connection between the transhumanist movement and what?
The avant-gardes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that last term.
Is there any necessary connection between the avant-gardes and the transhumanists?
The avant-gardes, yes.
Yes.
Well, it depends on what they consider themselves the avant-gardes of, and that I think would vary by era. So there have been different avant-garde philosophical movements, and in the 20th century the avant-garde philosophers were postmodernists, and they in effect created the era that transhumanism is rebelling against and seeking to transcend. So to some extent, transhumanism can be considered a kind of transmodernism or postmodernism or hypermodernism, if you would. But postmodernism essentially challenged people's conceptions of meaning and purpose by alleging that everything is just a socially constructed narrative, and to some extent it's all about power rather than about pursuit of objective well-being. And that has led to a crisis of meaning in the Western world especially, where a lot of people thought, well, if there are no fixed values, if it's all about power or subjective narrative, then what in the world am I doing here? And they become depressed, they become nihilistic, they lose the will to progress. But while some of the more traditional belief systems that the postmodernists challenged had their own issues, appeals to faith, tradition, authority, have certain flaws, even though in some cases they may have practical benefits as well, transhumanism offers the rekindling of hope and meaning and purpose by rooting it in technological progress, rooting it in objective improvements to human well-being, and telling people, look, we all live in the same world, we all inhabit a place that is still so flawed. We have death and disease and suffering and scarcity and war and all of these human cognitive biases as well. So let's work to overcome them, because there are pathways toward doing so. And that is a great source of meaning, because it doesn't rely on essentially a posited belief in a deity or an alternative reality that may or may not exist. And I, as an atheist, would say it doesn't exist, but that's not necessarily the position that every transhumanist would take. But what every transhumanist, I think, has in common is this view that human activity can improve the state of the world, can improve life through the use of science and technology. And that's a great unifier. Going to what Steele said, the challenge now, but also the opportunity, is to how to take all of these discrete paradigms of thought from the 20th century, the capitalists, the more socialist or techno-progressive leaning individuals, the people who are religious, the people who are more secular, and have them combine forces with this reinvigorated sense of purpose, because they all have something to contribute and they all have aspects of their vision that can be integrated into the next era of our human civilization.
That's good. Thank you.
Certainly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Steele, for joining us from all the way from Melbourne. We're going to move on now with our program. Unfortunately, it would appear that our next scheduled speaker isn't currently with us, but we do.
All right. I want to thank you all. I got to go do a show now. But fantastic. Thanks everybody. Thanks Ostinakachi again, and everybody else who was listening. Fantastic. Watch Detonation, by the way. Come on Detonation too, everybody. And we really appreciate it. And I'll see you all later. And, speaking of communication, political stunts are something that we need to really get better at doing. And Zoltan Itzvan did this thing called the Immortality Bus. And actually, I'm a fan of transhumanism, not because of Zoltan Itzvan and his Immortality Bus campaign. Actually, I was friends with Gennady Stolярov, chairman of the USTP, long before that. But I think if we need to come up with some innovative campaign stunts, forward them to the USTP. And those things are very viral in the mind. Driving a bus around America with a coffin on, it sticks in the mind pretty well. So I appreciate it all. I got to go, but thank you very much. You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Steele.